By 1945, Europe was physically and morally exhausted. 6 years of total war had destroyed the very foundations of European power. The continent's industrial base was shattered. Factories that once produced steel, machinery, and weapons were reduced to rubble. Railways and ports were bombed repeatedly, making transportation and trade nearly impossible. Power stations and energy networks were damaged or completely destroyed, leaving cities dark and cold. Major urban centers such as Berlin, Warsaw, Dresden, and Stalingrad were no longer functioning cities, but ruins filled with debris, hunger, and trauma. The human cost was just devastating. Tens of millions of people were dead, and many more were displaced. Refugees moved across the borders in massive numbers, searching for food, shelter, or family members who might still be alive. Entire generations had been wiped out. Societies were traumatized, and the governments struggled simply to maintain the order, let alone the project power abroad. Europe's strength had been drained not only by destruction but by loss of manpower, confidence, and legitimacy. More important than physical damage, however, was the loss of political independence. Before 1939, Europe had been the center of the global power. Britain ruled the vast empire. France controlled large colonial territories. Germany was an industrial and military giant. Italy had imperial influence, and remnants of older empires still shaped regional politics. European states competed, fought, and dominated much of the world. Global politics revolved around Europe. After 1945, however, this world no longer existed. Britain emerged from the war victorious but bankrupt. Its economy was shattered. Its debt was enormous, and its empire was unsustainable. France regained its sovereignty but remained politically unstable, divided, and economically weak. Germany, once the engine of European power, was defeated, occupied by foreign armies, and split into rival states. Italy was weakened and intentionally divided. No European country had the resources, unity, or authority to shape global events on its own. As a result, Europe could no longer act as the center of world politics. It became a region to be managed rather than a force that managed others. Decisions about security, economic recovery, and political alignment increasingly depended on outside powers. The continent that once fooled the world now needed protection, aid, and supervision. The destruction of Europe after World War II did more than end a war. It ended centuries of European dominance. The vacuum left behind ensured that a new global struggle would emerge, because in the world of politics, power does not tolerate emptiness. Someone always moves in to fill it. World War II did not just destroy armies, but it destroyed the imperial legitimacy. Britain could no longer afford empire. France lost Indochina and struggled in Algeria. The Dutch lost Indonesia, and Japan lost its power entirely. Colonial rule became economically unsustainable, militarily costly, and morally delegitimized. This produced dozens of new weak states across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. These states were poor, militarily vulnerable, and politically very unstable, which made them ideal arenas for the great power competition later. The Cold War did not start in Europe, but it spread because the empires collapsed. By 1945, only two states met the superpower criteria, the United States and Soviet Union. Everyone else depended on one of them for security, reconstruction, trade, and the political survival. This mattered because power concentration changes behavior. When many great powers exist, the alliances shift fluidly. When only two exist, rivalry hardens. Most of the historians define the Cold War as a period of geopolitical tension between two superpowers that are United States and the Soviet Union. This period is usually dated from 1945 to 1991, beginning at the end of the Second War and ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Within this time frame, most of the textbooks in the schools typically identify several key features like first, there is ideological conflict, that is capitalism versus communism. Second, there is military rivalry, including arms races and strategic planning. Third, there is a nuclear deterrence, often summarized through the idea of mutually assured destruction. Fourth, there are proxy wars fought in regions outside Europe and North America. Finally, there is a crucial absence, the absence of direct large-scale war between the two superpowers. This is the definition that appears in the classrooms, documentaries, and popular histories. And as a description, it is accurate. But the accuracy is not the same as understanding. A descriptive definition only tells us what happened. It names actors, lists features, and establishes a timeline. Well, this is useful too. Without the description, history collapses into abstraction. But description alone does not explain causation, persistence, or meaning. To say that the Cold War involved ideological conflict does not explain why ideology became the dominant language of rivalry. To say it involved nuclear deterrence does not explain why nuclear weapons produced stability instead of war. To say it involved the proxy wars does not explain why great powers avoided the direct conflict. It is believed that ideologically it was about capitalism versus communism, that the Cold War existed because these two belief systems were incompatible. This seems plausible at first because ideologies matter. They shape how societies understand themselves and others. But if ideologies were the primary cause, we would expect certain things that we do not actually observe. For example, ideological compatibilities had existed throughout the history without producing global standoffs of this kind. Religious conflict, monarchism versus republicanism, fascism versus liberalism, and none of them produced a sustained, decades-long global rivalry without direct wars between the main power. Furthermore, ideological explanations struggle to explain restraint. If ideology alone were decisive, why did the superpower repeatedly avoid the direct confrontation? The Cold War involved arms races, strategic planning, and constant preparation for conflict. Yet what makes this rivalry unusual is not its intensity, but its restraint. Historically, military rivalry between great powers tend to result in war. Yet during the Cold War, the war between the superpowers never occurred. But why did rivalry persist without escalation? Why did preparation for the war coexist with avoidance of war? These questions cannot be answered by description alone. The superpowers fought indirectly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Again, this is often described as ideological export, which communism versus capitalism on the foreign soil. But once again, this framing is incomplete. Proxy wars served a strategic function. They allowed competition without direct confrontation. They displaced violence geographically and politically. But what purpose did proxy wars serve in sustaining a stable rivalry? Without that question, proxy wars appear chaotic. With it, they appear systematic. In 1949, NATO was created to stop the Soviet invasion and to militarily secure the Western Europe. NATO turned Western Europe into a permanent military forward base and the most heavily defended region in the world. This included U.S. troops stationed in West Germany, air bases across Britain, Italy, and Turkey, missile deployments aimed eastward, Europe became the central battlefield in NATO war planning. Every NATO strategy assumed a Soviet invasion through the filter gap, massive conventional fighting, and rapid nuclear escalation. At the peak of the Cold War, over 250,000 US troops were stationed in West Germany. Many units lived within artillery range of Warsaw Pact forces. Soldiers often joked that they had a 15-minute life expectancy if war began. Entire German towns economically depended on US bases, bars, schools, marriages, mixed families, everything. The most feared invasion route was the Filter Gap, a flat corridor perfect for the Soviet tanks. If Soviets had invaded, the American soldiers would have been endangered, and USA could have been forced into the war. The US had built their air bases in UK for strategic bombers, in Italy for their Mediterranean reach, and in Turkey for their direct proximity to USSR. Some pilots were on 24-hour nuclear alert, sleeping in flight suits. Planes were loaded, fueled, and ready to launch within minutes, and local populations often didn't know whether nuclear weapons were stored nearby. NATO deployed Pershing II missiles in Europe during the 1980s. These missiles had flight time to Moscow of 6 to 8 minutes. This terrified Soviet leadership more than long-range ICBMs. Millions protested across Europe against these missiles, and the USSR feared a decapitation strike before it could respond. The irony of Cold War is that Cold War did not stay peaceful because people trusted each other. It stayed peaceful because they trusted fear more than hope. In October 1959, during the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro overthrew a US-backed dictator called Batista. Castro then aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. The US saw this as a communist foothold 90 miles from Florida. In 1961, the US supported a failed invasion by Cuban exiles. Castro became convinced that the US would try again, so he was looking for the direct Soviet assistance against the United States. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane photographed missile sites in Cuba. These were medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles, capable of striking Washington, D.C., New York, and much of the eastern U.S. President John F. Kennedy was informed 2 days later the missiles were not yet operational, which created a narrow window for action. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had several motives to have those missiles in Cuba. The U.S. had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy close to the USSR. Cuba would place Soviet missiles equally close to U.S., and that, according to Khrushchev, was justified. He wanted to show that the USSR was a true superpower, not inferior. President Kennedy had to make a decision, and time had a limit. He rejected the idea of immediate strike on USSR for full invasion of Cuba, as that would have caused a war. Instead, he chose a naval blockade, renamed a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of war. U.S. Navy ships surrounded Cuba. Soviet ships carrying missiles components were warned not to cross. This was a direct military confrontation between two superpowers. Between October 24th and 27th, Soviet ships approached the blockade line. Some of them turned back at the last moment. One U.S. U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. At the point, U.S. military commanders urged Kennedy to strike, but that never happened. The U.S. did not know that the tactical nuclear weapons were already in Cuba, and the Soviet commanders had authority to use them if invaded. Meanwhile, a Soviet submarine B-59 was trapped underwater by U.S. depth charges near Cuba. Inside the submarine, temperatures exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. Oxygen was low. Communications with Moscow was lost. The crew believed that the World War III had already begun. In order to launch a nuclear torpedo, 3 officers had to agree. Two did, one did not. The officer that did not agree was Vasily Arkhipov. He refused to authorize the launch. If he had agreed, the US fleet would have been nuked, and retaliation would have been automatic. Vasily's hesitation likely prevented the nuclear war. The resolution of Cuban Missile Crisis hinged on two dramatically different letters sent by Nikita Khrushchev to John F. Kennedy on how Kennedy chose to interpret and respond to them. First letter was sent on October 26, 1962, and it was emotional, where Nikita Khrushchev paraphrased that if US guaranteed not to invade Cuba, the missiles would be removed from there. Something changed overnight, and Khrushchev wrote the second letter on 27th. And in this one, he played tough. He demanded the US to remove the Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey, and only then the Soviets will take their missiles out of Cuba. This letter reframed the crisis as a strategic trade, not a humanitarian escape. Kennedy faced a dilemma. If he had accepted that second letter publicly, that would have made him and US look weak. Rejecting could have led to the nuclear war. He came up with a strategy. His strategy was to publicly respond only to the first letter and agree to non-invasion of Cuba, hence having a peaceful resolution, and then privately accepted the demands of the second letter and initiated the process to remove the missiles from Turkey. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed in exchange for a US non-invasion pledge and implicit understanding on Turkish missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially ended. Fast forward to 1983, when Soviet early warning systems reported multiple US missiles incoming. Protocol demanded the immediate retaliation. Stanislav Petrov was the officer on duty. He noticed something very odd, that only a few missiles had appeared. A real attack would have involved hundreds of them. His experience played a big part when he called it a false alarm, and he was right. A satellite error had mistaken sunlight reflections for missiles. Had he followed the protocol, the USSR would have launched the nuclear weapons. Every Cold War story reveals the same truth. Systems were rigid, protocols were deadly, and the human judgment saved the world repeatedly. The Cold War stayed cold not because it was safe, but because it was constantly on the edge. In the US and USSR, the children practiced nuclear drills, families built fallout shelters, and films taught people to duck and cover. People lived normal lives under the assumption that the world could end in 30 minutes. Some of the Soviet spies also helped the US and the Allies to prevent the nuclear disaster. Oleg Penkovsky, a high-ranking Soviet officer, secretly worked for the West. He was able to provide the missile data, nuclear capabilities, and some of the Soviet military plans. His information helped the US understand the Soviet weaknesses, bluff versus real threat during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and some of the other Soviet plans. Unfortunately, he was eventually caught and executed. He did not defect for money, but he defected because he feared the nuclear war. The war was not just limited to the Western world. Korean War from 1950 to 1953 killed 3 million people. Majority were civilians. Cities were flattened and infrastructure was erased. The country was split into two hostile states. U.S. bombing campaigns in Vietnam killed 3 to 4 million people. The effects of the chemical warfare, also known as Agent Orange, still harm people today. Later on, the war was expanded to Laos and Cambodia. Afghanistan is the Cold War's longest shadow. Soviet invasion from 1979 to 1989 killed and displaced the millions of Afghans. The invasion resulted in the militarization of society, collapse of state, and giving birth to multiple extremist groups. Afghanistan never recovered because the Cold War destroyed its political foundation, not just its cities. Cold War ended in 1991 with the fall of USSR, but I wouldn't call it the end of the Cold War. It never ended. What ended was one side of it. The collapse of the Soviet Union removed the player, not the system, that produced the Cold War. One of the reasons why USSR collapsed was due to their bad economic planning. The Soviet economy was not designed to make people wealthy. It was designed to make the state powerful. The Soviet Union operated a centrally planned economy. At the center was Gosplan, the state planning body. Gosplan decided what to produce, how much to produce, where to produce it, and who received at what prices. There was no market pricing, no competition, no private ownership of the major industries. The economy was treated like a military operation, not a marketplace. Dr. Zhivago, a novel written by Boris Pasternak, gives a pretty good idea of the misery of the Soviet economy. In the early Cold War, the Soviet model worked frighteningly well. For the certain goals, though, there was rapid industrialization, full employment, huge growth in steel, coal, oil, electricity, ability to mobilize resources instantly, and no internal resistance to the state priorities were the great advantages. This allowed the USSR to rebuild after World War II, industrialize Eastern Europe, develop the nuclear weapons, launch the Sputnik satellite, and build the world's largest army. The Soviet economy was excellent at producing tanks, missiles, factories, and soldiers. But the system prioritized steel over shoes, missiles over medicine, and tanks over televisions. Consumer goods were secondary, comfort was irrelevant. Efficiency was measured in output, not equality. And this produced the chronic shortages, long lines, poor quality goods, and the black market. But politically, the leadership accepted this trade off because political survival mattered more than the living standards of people. By the height of the Cold War, 15 to 20% of the Soviet GDP went to defense. Entire cities existed solely to build weapons. Scientists and the engineers were absorbed by the military projects. The Soviet Union could match the US nuclear arsenals, maintain parity in the conventional forces, and project power globally. But this came at a cost. Civilian innovation stagnated, the productivity fell, and the technology lagged outside the military sector. The economy became lopsided, powerful but brittle. Central planning was terrible at innovation, consumer responsiveness, efficiency, adapting to change because factories were rewarded for meeting quotas, not improving quality. Failure was punished, so risk-taking absolutely vanished. Information flowed upward slowly and inaccurately. Managers lied to meet targets, and innovation required, competition, incentives, feedback, and failure. The Soviet system suppressed all four of them. By the late Cold War, growth had already stagnated, technology gap was widened, and the consumer dissatisfaction was skyrocketing. Also, the military costs became unbearable. The entire system hit a wall. Attempts at reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev, known as Perestroika and Glasnost, exposed the system's weaknesses instead of fixing them. Once fear disappeared, the economy collapsed very quickly. The US economy, on the other hand, was built to serve growth and let the power emerge from it. That difference shaped the entire Cold War. In 1944, the US designed the global economic system at Bretton Woods Conference. US dollar became the global reserve currency. Dollar was backed by gold. The other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank were created. This meant the global trade ran through American finance. The Marshall Plan in 1947 rebuilt the Western Europe. It revived the European industry, prevented the communist political takeovers, tied European economies to the US markets, and created loyal allies. This was strategic genius. Prosperity reduced revolution, integration reduced defection, and aid replaced the occupation. Where the USSR imposed control by force, the US imposed influence through capital and consumption. The Cold War America was not a laissez-faire economy. The US economy combined the private enterprises, strong unions until the 1970s, the massive government spending, heavy regulations, and military industrial coordination. The state did not plan production, but it directed incentives. Highways, aerospace, nuclear power, computers, the internet, all emerged from the state-backed investment. The American economy won not because it was fairer or more moral or more equal, but because it was flexible and innovative and decentralized, resilient, and globally integrated. The Soviet economy was strong under pressure. The US economy thrived under change. The American model, though chaotic and unequal, proved adaptable. It could absorb shocks, discard failures, and continuously reinvent itself. That adaptability, more than any single weapon or policy, became one of the decisive structural advantages of the US economy during the Cold War. The Cold War was not only about the communism versus capitalism. That's the ideological story. Structurally, the Cold War was about the great power competition and the fear under anarchy, also security dilemmas and balance of power. And those conditions, they still exist. As long as there is no world government, powerful states fear each other, the Cold War logic is still here. After 1991, the US became the sole superpower. NATO expanded eastwards, and Russia collapsed economically and politically. And this created a unipolar moment, not a new system. By the 2000s, Russia rebuilt state power, China rose economically and militarily, the US began facing peer competitors again. And that was the moment when Cold War dynamics quietly restarted. But now, no Iron Curtain, no single ideology, and no clear blocks yet. Instead, technology wars, sanctions, proxy conflicts, information warfare, and the arms races are there. This is the Cold War, but without the banner. NATO was supposed to dissolve as the part of the deal, but did not dissolve after the USSR fell. Instead, it survived, redefined itself, and gradually expanded eastward. The decision became one of the most consequential geopolitical developments of the post-Cold War. To understand why this expansion mattered so deeply, one has to look at the issue not from the Washington or the Brussels, but from Moscow. For centuries, Russian strategic thinking has been shaped by geography. Russia lacks natural defensive barriers in the West and has historically been invaded through the open plains by Napoleon, by Imperial Germany, and most catastrophically, by Nazi Germany. As a result, Russian security doctrine has always emphasized buffer zones. That means the neighboring territories that absorb pressure and create distance between Russia's core and potential enemies. During the Cold War, Eastern Europe fulfilled this function. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were not merely ideological allies, they were strategic depth. They pushed any potential NATO confrontation hundreds of miles away from Moscow. When the Soviet bloc collapsed, that entire buffer system disappeared almost overnight. Russia went from being protected by layers of allied states to being directly adjacent to the NATO territory. NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe in the late 1990s and 2000s, bringing in countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, and others was seen in the West was a stabilizing and defensive move. These countries actively sought NATO membership to protect themselves from the future Russian pressure. From NATO's internal logic, expansion was not about aggression, but about securing peace, looking into democratic reforms, and preventing power vacuums. However, international politics is not shaped by intentions alone. It is shaped by perceptions. From Russia's perspective, a military alliance that once existed to counter the Soviet Union was now moving closer to the Russian borders, incorporating former Soviet allies and even former Soviet republics. Military infrastructure, joint exercises, missile defense systems, and rotational troop deployments began appearing in the regions that had once served as strategic buffers. What NATO described as defensive reassurance looked, from Moscow, like encirclement. This clash of perceptions produced a classic security dilemma. NATO increased its presence to reassure its members and deter aggression. Russia interpreted those same moves as threatening, prompting it to modernize its military, assert control over the nearby regions, and draw red lines around places like Ukraine and Georgia. Each side viewed its own actions as defensive and the others as provocative. Fear fed fear, and distrust became self-reinforcing. This dynamic is deeply rooted in the Cold War logic. During the original Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union built alliances, deployed forces, and expanded military capabilities primarily out of fear of the other side. Neither side believed it was acting aggressively, both believed they were preventing catastrophe. The same structural pattern reemerged after 1991, even though the ideological conflict had faded. The result in that, despite the formal end of the Cold War, its underlying mechanics returned. A weakened Russia facing the loss of strategic depth and the advance of the powerful military alliances reverted to a defensive posture that relied on the power projection, sphere of influence, thinking, and deterrence. NATO, convinced of its defensive nature and more legitimacy, continued to expand and reinforce its eastern flank. What makes the situation especially unstable is that both sides believe they are reacting, not initiating. NATO says it is protecting vulnerable states. Russia says it is defending itself from encirclement. Neither side feels fully responsible for escalation, which makes compromise harder. This is precisely why security dilemmas are so dangerous. They arise not from evil intentions, but from incompatible fears operating within an anarchic international system. In that sense, NATO's post-Cold War expansion did not simply reshape Europe's political map. It recreated the psychological and strategic conditions of Cold War itself, even in the absence of a clear ideological battle. The rivalry between China and the United States has grown much stronger in recent years. Many people explain this conflict by saying the US fears China is spreading communism. While there is some truth in that claim, ideology is not the main reason relations have become so tense. The real cause are more practical and structural. This rivalry is about power, control, and who shapes the future of global system. One major source of tension is global supply chains. Over the last few decades, China became the world's main manufacturing center. Many essential products, from electronics to medical supplies, are made there. This gave China economic strength, but it also made other countries dependent on Chinese factories. From the US point of view, this dependence is dangerous. In a crisis or conflict, China could disrupt supplies and weaken the American economy. That is why the US is trying to bring manufacturing back home or move it to the friendly countries. This is not just about trade, it is about the national security. Technology is another key area of competition. The United States has long been the global leader in advanced technology. China is now catching up fast in areas like artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and computer chips. This worries Washington because advanced technology is closely linked to the military power and economic dominance. That is why the US places restrictions on Chinese tech companies and limits access to the advanced chips. The fight is about who controls the technologies that will run the world in the coming decades. The US has dominated the oceans since World War II, protecting the global trade routes and projecting military strength. China wants more control over nearby seas, especially the South China Sea and areas around Taiwan. From China's perspective, this is about protecting its borders and trade routes. From the US perspective, China's growing navy threatens freedom of the navigation and the existing balance of power. Both sides, they see their actions as defensive, but each views the other as aggressive. China is expanding its presence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America by investing in infrastructure, offering loans, and building the political partnerships. These efforts increase China's influence and reduce US dominance in many regions. The United States worries that this shift will weaken the global order it helped build after the World War II, one based on the Western rules and leadership. The deepest issue, however, is about who makes the rules in the future. International politics runs on rules about trade, technology, standards, finance, and security. For a long time, these rules were mostly written by the United States and its allies. China now wants a bigger role in settling those rules. This creates tension because rule-making power determines whose interests are protected and whose values shape the global system. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe it for more to come.